This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On June the 28th, RCMI member Dr. Vivian McAlister, adjunct professor of history at Western University in London, Ontario, and a medical combat veteran, spoke to our Defence and Security Studies evening on Borders, Flashpoints for Conflict.
Okay, well, good evening. And welcome to the Defense and Security Studies program of the Royal Canadian Military Institute for the month of June 2022. I'm Dr. Daniel Eustace. I'm the director of the program, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event. We're very privileged tonight to have Dr. Vivian McAlister with us. This is not the first time Vivian has spoken to the RCMI, and as I seem to recall, the last two talks that he gave were on two entirely different subjects altogether, and this one will be an entirely different subject altogether once again. So this is obviously demonstrative of his range of interest and his expertise, and it's wonderful to see Vivian again. The last many weeks and months, the world's attention has been focused on Ukraine for obviously good reasons. When Vivian contacted me and he suggested that we might want to do something on the topic of borders, and specifically the Anglo-Irish Common Trade Area agreement, my first thought was, why would I want to do that? This is not something that typically would fall within the context of the Defense and Security Studies program. But after reflecting upon it, I came to the conclusion that actually he was right on topic in terms of the significance of borders as flashpoints for conflict. And clearly, there's a relevant piece here in terms of the Ukraine conflict, where from Russia's perspective, at least, if not the Ukraine's as well, it's all about the border. It's all about whether there even is a border. And then reflecting further in terms of how other nations deal with that issue, and Canada, in fact, how, it's very complex in the Canadian-US context, for example. We won't go into that in any great detail. We don't have time. But, borders are thought of not only as sort of legal boundaries, but also as psychological boundaries, as cultural boundaries, as social boundaries, as economic boundaries. And nations deal with boundaries in different ways. So it turned out to, as I thought more about it, this is absolutely something we need to talk about. So tonight, we're very privileged to have Vivian with us. I'm not going to introduce him per se. You have received our flyer for tonight's event. What I'd like to do, though, for a moment is just turn to Vivian, ask him to take himself off mute, if I may, and ask him to just describe a little bit about the transition that's happened with him in the last few months, because some things have changed for him in the last few months, which I think are quite interesting. So Vivian, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you're up to these days.
Well, thank you, Dan. And, I'm very grateful to the group for including me in this series. So in April, I retired clinically. Some years ago, I think in 2019, actually, I retired from the Canadian military. But as a medical officer, I was seconded and working in the University Hospital in London, Ontario. And my background specialty is transplantation. So I was continuing to do that through the pandemic. But having reached the fine age of 66, I thought it was time to retire clinically as well. But I'm in the process of trying to rejig my interests, and the Department of History in University of Western Ontario very kindly agreed to have me as an adjunct professor. So my focus academically will be more towards history in the future.
That's great. That's a great transition. Wonderful. Well, you're going to give us a bit of a history lesson tonight, I think. So I'm looking forward to it. I won't grade your paper though, although
you're welcome to. Being an adjunct, you're unpaid and there's no expectation. So it's fantastic. It's the way
I. Wonderful.
I'll share screen and get going.
Right. So let me just one little bit of housekeeping notes. So ladies and gentlemen, on the attendee side, we do have the chat function turned off. It tends to be a bit of a distractor. So if you have questions and answers, please use the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to type in your question at any time, and I will do my best at the end of Vivian's discussion to cover as many of those questions as I possibly can. If they tend to focus on something similar, I may take the liberty of doing a bit of editing and try to get the point across in a single question. But please feel free to ask them at any time. So with that, Vivian, please, we look forward to your presentation. And I understand you're going to share your screen with us.
Thank you, Dan. Here I go.
I'm going to turn mine off.
How does it look?
Looks good to me.
Okay. Well, look, thank you very much, Dan, and the group for including me and including this topic in our series. As you say, I think it's actually important, but I'll explain why I think that as we go through. So this is the decade of centenaries in Ireland, starting in 2012, commemorating the Ulster Convention and Covenant in 1912 with Sir Edward Carson, and all the way through very momentous events until 1922. And we'll cover some of those now. Now, among the centenaries is this Common Travel Area Agreement, but I don't think there'll be any obvious celebrations in Ireland, and I think they underestimate, and we all underestimate, how important this agreement really is and what a milestone it was 100 years ago. My ideas on this started in November last year when Heather Hiscox asked me to fill a moment on Remembrance Day about the centenary of the poppy. And I was ready for that, but she asked me what did I think about Canada's involvement in Afghanistan, knowing that I had served there several times. And of course, at that time, we were dealing with the return of the Taliban. You know, I should have been better prepared to answer that question. And I mumbled that I thought the process was not yet over, and that if the Afghan people could win the peace, and especially if Canada could help them win the peace, then certainly our commitment in combat was worthwhile. So today, I started to think about the transition from war to peace, rather than what's more commonly studied, it would be factors that result in war or the conduct of war. I want to focus more on the transition to peace and how you can actually win the peace. I'm going to present this Common Travel Area Agreement, which is a very mundane name, between Ireland and the United Kingdom, and present it to you as actually a very powerful tool to win that peace. We'll discuss the impact of the CTA. We'll look at other travel arrangements so that you can see how powerful this particular one is. We'll see how it might have a role in some conflicts in the 100 years that it's been in operation, if parallels had been used elsewhere in the world. And as you say, we'll look at the Russian-Ukrainian war and the invasion of Ukraine and consider, you know, how it might be applied there. But I would like to say that I have I don't presume to have answers for the situation there, nor am I making any moral judgments there. I'm trying to look at this more independently. Now, it's important for historians and scientists, really, in any discussion like this, to declare your interests. And as you can hear from my accent, I was born and I grew up in Ireland, but I'm a Canadian citizen and I've worked all my adult life in Canada, including service for 11 years as a medical officer in the Canadian Armed Forces. However, my grandfather, Charles McAlister, was a member of the Irish Defence Forces for all of his working life. As a young boy, he joined Na Fianna, which is the Republican Boy Scouts. And in 1913, he took the oath to the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the IRB as it's known over in Ireland, and the Fenians, as we know it on this side of the Atlantic. In 1916, he mobilized with the Belfast Brigade, but they received countermanding orders and he did not take part, or they did not take part in the rebellion. Between 1919 and 1921, he was a member of the IRA, and he functioned as an intelligence officer, working eventually with General Headquarters in Dublin. In 1921 and through 1922, he was a truce liaison officer in Dublin, working out of the Gresham Hotel. This was probably the high point of his career, and his task was to try and prevent any incidents breaking the truce. So he would go to events in prisons, in barracks, in various places to try and cool the situation. And in this time, he met a British civil servant known as Andy Cope. It was Sir Alfred Cope later, but Andy Cope and my grandfather would go to some of these events to try and prevent the truce from breaking down in Dublin. Cope is, you'll see later, a very important British civil servant. My grandfather was really a man on the ground. On one occasion, Cope and my grandfather, they were held up by the Republican element within the IRA who did not agree with the treaty, and their car was stolen. There was a shot fired, and we believe it was by Andy Cope, who was the civil servant, and the car was recovered. And henceforth, they used to go around with security. But at the same time, the Secret Service, various secret services within the British forces were actually watching Andy Cope because they were very concerned about his loyalty and what he was up to. And my grandfather then completed his career in the Defence Forces, involved in the Civil War, but then in the regular army until 1958. So back in 100 years ago, in January 1922, it was a very tense time in Ireland. There had been a truce and a cessation of fighting. All right. So what was happening at this particular time in January was that the truce was in effect. The treaty had been negotiated in England, and they had brought it back for discussion in Ireland. It had been reviewed with a general election and then reviewed in the parliament known as the Dáil in Ireland. And on both occasions, it was passed by the majority. However, there was a significant minority who did not agree, and they actually withdrew from the parliament, and there was a threat of war. Michael Collins, who led the delegation from the Dáil, went to Dublin Castle for the handover. And there he met the Lord Lieutenant, where it is the equivalent of our Governor General. And it was a polite but quick proceedings where Collins introduced his colleagues, and then the Governor General informed them that they were now installed as the provisional government. In addition, he wished them the best, and he expressed his hope that under their auspices and the ideal of a happy, free, and prosperous Ireland would be attained. The Lieutenant Governor, Lord Fitzalan, sent telegrams to the British government and to the King to say what had happened, And the king replied as follows. He was pleased to hear about the establishment of the provisional government in Ireland, and then he included a sentence that he was confident that the British authorities would help the members of the provisional government to accomplish the task that lay before them. So I think everybody understood that there was a very significant task for this new government. Michael Collins was described by the press of the day as bouncing out of the chief secretary's doorway and pushing Mr. Duggan and Mr. Cosgrave into the leading car. He was clearly very excited and anxious to get started, but he did have a task in hand. They returned immediately to the Mansion House in Dublin, where the provisional government would be initially, and also where the Parliament, the Dáil, was meeting. This is a picture of that particular group. And you can see that it's quite diminished in numbers because a significant minority have withdrawn, and they are actually in the process of taking arms and preparing for civil war. The first task that this government, or the first order from this government, was that all government officials and all civil servants should continue their task and remain at work. It was a very important order. Now, if we just look at the war that the Irish and British had fought prior to these happenings, and look at some of the elements, I've displayed those on the right of your screen. On the left of your screen are some of those parallels that I think exist for the Ukraine and Russia. Ireland and the Ukraine are both small countries beside, smaller countries beside very large neighbors. In Ireland, they considered it a war of independence. And the minority owed allegiance. There was, although they had won this war of independence, the minority felt they had allegiance to the opponent. There was a language war that had been fought throughout this period where they tried to introduce Gaelic. While the cultural war was won, the ability to speak the language was never very successful, but it was very, very important, and it distinguished groups within the country. There were religious differences within the country, and while everybody tried to diminish the importance of religious differences, often they magnified some of the problems that they faced. There was a separated region in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, that had its own government and would have some problems for them for two reasons. One, it was a separated region, but also the powers that the Northern Ireland government were much more similar to the provincial governments in Canada, whereas the powers that the government in Dublin had were similar to the government in Ottawa. There were diaspora, there's a large diaspora, and one of the significant importance of that, while they support the efforts made for independence, they sometimes had unrealistic expectations of the new government. From the British perspective, there was a very large Irish presence in Britain. And Britain was trying to deal with transition regarding the empire. They looked at Ireland as a precedent that could result in the breakup of the empire, and the transition to the Commonwealth was beginning at this particular time. I think there are absolute parallels for Ukraine and Russia, as outlined there. While Ukraine call it, they are defending their independence, Russia has called it a military action, very similar to suppression of rebellion that Britain felt that they were doing in Ireland. There is a minority allegiance to Russia within the Ukraine. They have a language war underway where they're trying to introduce the Ukrainian language in various places where Russian was the main language. There are religious differences. Sometimes we don't know about them, but the Orthodox Church has split in the Ukraine, where a significant proportion of the church no longer recognizes Kirill as their senior patriarch in Russia. Obviously, there's a separated region where the war is now undertaken, and they, like Ireland, have a very big diaspora. There is also a significant Ukrainian presence in Russia. Ukrainians are actually the largest non-Russian minority within Russia itself. And then Russia has this uncertain relationship with empire. We don't know if they're looking for the old Russian Empire or the Soviet Empire, or are they looking for some sort of Russian equivalent to the Commonwealth? And I think that latter may well be true. So let's just see what happened in Ireland. It turns out that the transition with respect to the military is the easy part. And I'm just playing here a Pathé newsreel that occurred at that particular time. The first thing that they did was keep the IRA in discipline as much as possible, given that there was separation going on with the Civil War. They also they formed the National Army and put uniforms on all of the members of the IRA, and they became a military, and they accepted an orderly handover from the British forces of the barracks and the police barracks. They disbanded the police and replaced them with either some police that were continuing or in the new force, but also made it up with IRA members. This transition is very important, but it's actually relatively easy. But you will note that George Bush and his government did not do that in Iraq after the invasion. And many believe that that was a big mistake. You will see that the withdrawal of the British forces is actually very cordial, and all of the anger that had occurred during combat seemed to dissipate completely. And there was an orderly withdrawal where the Irish wished the soldiers who were leaving well. This is also in marked contrast to the way we left Afghanistan and the US forces in Vietnam. So the challenge that the Irish government faced was to win the peace. And I think this is a much more difficult task than the simple transition of the military forces. And we'll look at some of the problems that they faced. The situation almost immediately became completely complicated by the development of civil war. One of the factors in the outbreak of civil war was the assassination and the murder of Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson. Now, while he was a curmudgeon, the assassination was totally unjustified and occurred many months after the cessation of hostilities, and he was retired. The irony in this murder was that Wilson was, I think, a 13th generation Irish-born man who grew up in Ireland and had his career in the British Army, becoming chief of the of the British Army, whereas his murderers were third generation British who identified as Irish and were members of the IRA. The British government gave the Irish government an ultimatum that if you don't deal with the Republican faction who disagree with the treaty, that they would come back and deal with them. So there was a threat of war while they had to try and win this peace. What faced the negotiators at that time and the planners at the time was that Ireland was totally integrated into Great Britain. Every single aspect of life was part of the British system. I've listed them here, and I'll only really, rather than go through them, just mention the labor market. As you know, there was a large number of Irish residents who would go to England to work. And it wasn't just as domestics and low-paid work, such as working on the roads. They worked in every aspect of the British economy and indeed at every level. And they were a significant contributor to the British labour market itself. I have also mentioned how there were differing forms of government in Northern Ireland and in the Irish Free State, which could have hampered the ambitions of the Irish government, and they could have resulted in failure. Well, there was an overwhelming requirement from the people that the status quo maintain. They did not want to be restricted in any way. And I think that also went through all of the civil servants. So I think the Common Travel Area Agreement actually arose because of a desire to maintain the status quo with the new situation where Ireland was independent, but almost very closely joined to Britain. The Common Travel Area Agreement states that citizens are allowed move across the border freely. And initially it meant without showing any identification. And even in my time, we grew up without having any ID, and we would go to Britain without ID. Our driver's license was not actually sufficient as an identification at that time. However, the Common Travel Area Agreement was much broader than that. It entitled citizens of either country to move to the other country and take up residence, where they would be entitled to all the rights and subject to all the responsibilities of the residents of that country. So Irish people can move to Britain and undertake all of the normal activities of life in Britain and are entitled to vote. Likewise, British citizens are entitled to move to Ireland, and this situation has remained for 100 years. Clearly, there had to be some arrangements regarding an alignment of foreign entry into both jurisdictions. So they agreed to this plan in 1922, and it did not start till January 1923. The reason for this was that it's not well known, but the treaty came into action in January of 1922, but because of the importance of this sort of agreement and how life would work in the new arrangement, they suspended many aspects of the treaty until January 1923. The Common Travel Area Agreement was an amorphous type of an agreement at that time and didn't even have the name that we currently give it. It was formulated in 1925, and it's continued essentially until today. During the Second World War, Ireland did not join the Allies, did not join Britain, and remained neutral. This was a major realignment. But the Common Travel Area Agreement continued with the change that they have said it was suspended, but really it continued with the change that permission was required to cross the border and identification was required. However, the same rules applied to people in Northern Ireland as in the Free State of Ireland. It was reintroduced completely in 1952, and the delay in reintroducing it after the Second World War was due to the efforts by the British government of the day to try and have complete realignment of foreign entry into the Free State of Ireland at the time. The government of Ireland refused, and the Common Travel Area Agreement was actually reactivated in its original form at the request or due to pressure from Northern Ireland loyalists, because they no longer wanted to be under the controls, the wartime controls. So it was continued from 52 until today, but in 73, it was superseded by the free movement rules of the European Economic Union with the joint entry of Ireland and Britain into the EEC. Following the withdrawal of Britain from the European Union, it has been redeployed. And it was one of the first things that the government of Britain, the governments of Europe and Ireland agreed to, said that the Common Travel Area would be redeployed And that was agreed right at the very beginning. The current disputes are about the movement of goods, not about the movement of people. So this agreement has survived quite a large number of serious events. The civil war that I outlined went on for another year of conflict, and it persisted for 10 years before there was a political rapprochement. Conflict in Northern Ireland flared up at various times. In 1922, the biggest threat was a pogrom of Catholics in Belfast, threatened the whole island in that they couldn't stand by. The same sort of motivation occurred in more recent conflicts in Northern Ireland. After the war, there was a border campaign, again, which should have disrupted the CTA, but it didn't. There was an economic war in the 1930s when the Republicans gained the government of Ireland and De Valera became the prime minister known as the Taoiseach. That war continued for a long time and did great harm to Ireland, but the CTA continued. There have been several constitutional crises that were going on in Britain. With the Westminster Act in the 1920s, the governments of the Commonwealth became independent of the Parliament in London. So it gave greater power in Ottawa, but also greater power in Dublin. And when events like the abdication occurred, there were negotiations that had to be made with the prime ministers of all the governments of the Commonwealth, including Ireland. But the CTA survived all of that. It survived the neutrality in the Second World War, as I described. After the war, Britain went through great changes, especially with immigration. A lot of migration occurred to Britain, and they're still feeling the effect of some of those things. But the CTA continued, and despite all of that, Irish people could move freely into Britain and take up residence and employment. We described the European Economic Community. There was a separation of our currencies in the 1990s, where Ireland joined the euro and Britain did not. Brexit has increased the change in alignment. So now Ireland is aligned differently to Britain for the first time towards Europe, and Britain going its own way, but still so far the CTA has survived. And lastly, COVID caused a bit of friction because there were different types of lockdowns in the different jurisdictions. The lockdown was harsher in Ireland and the outcome was better than it was in Britain and in Northern Ireland. But the travel area agreement that I've described, and just in case you didn't see the significance of these agreements, really is much more than about travel. If a doctor moves from one jurisdiction to the other, is he still a doctor? And they decided, yes, that physicians graduating in Ireland could practice in England and vice versa. So that required the recognition of qualifications. That also required the recognition of systems of education in universities, colleges, and high schools. There was a divergence between the system of education in Britain after the Second World War, where they adopted the specialized A-level system, and Ireland continued the generalized education with the leaving certificate, but they continued to recognize each other's high school training. There had to be arrangements for pensioners, for health and social welfare, and these systems were being developed in Britain. They were very rudimentary in Ireland, but there had to be bilateral arrangements, and very like our provinces, I think we influenced each other, especially Britain influencing Ireland, so that these programs were also set up in Ireland. A common banking system continued. I have looked up extradition as much as I can, because I don't remember there ever being extradition cases between Britain and Ireland. But yes, indeed, the CTA resulted in an expedited type of extradition where people could be transferred without proof of guilt or hearings. So the prolonged extradition hearings that you hear now about the WikiLeaks founder, etc., would not occur between Ireland and Britain. And finally, transport and tax of goods is not covered by the CTA. There are other travel area agreements, and we can see, compare them to this CTA. The Schengen area involves multiple countries in Europe, but it's really facilitating passage across borders without passports or minimal checking of passports. It does not give people right of residence. The European Union, or the European Community as it was known, modeled, I think, its free movement on the CTA. The CTA precedes it by about 30 years, but it extended it considerably. So instead of now recognizing each other's qualifications, they set about having common standards. And actually, I think this is the breaking point for Britain and why they are leaving the European community. So they extended the form of cooperation that occurs with the CTA. Interprovincial arrangements in Canada are very similar to the CTA, that we can move from one province to the other without any permission and without identification, and so we can start working. But they don't have quite the same level of recognition of each other's qualifications. So there are some differences there. And I think some of those differences are getting bigger with the changes that are occurring in Quebec. Dan, you mentioned Ireland and the US. We've never had a CTA with the United States, but we did have more easy crossing of the border with simpler identification, just using our driver's license and less regulation until the 9/11 attacks. And things have only got worse with changes of government in the US and with COVID. Now, there are several countries that underwent transition during this period without a CTA, with what I think are very tragic results. The Berlin Wall in 1961 separated people in Germany and resulted in great hardship. The West side managed to survive. The East had an involuted development and suffered terribly from this wall that they themselves constructed. And I think it's fair to say that Germany is only reaching its potential now that they are united and there are no more barriers. All of the Iron Curtain countries suffered from the barrier that they put up on their own people leaving, and resulted in stunted growth that is only now being addressed with the change in their circumstance. Perhaps the most tragic of all transition was in the Indian subcontinent in 1947 with independence of Pakistan and India. They had no arrangements for free travel and taking up residence. They tried to have some form of exchange of populations, and there was a large number of people killed, and hardship that started then and I think continues to this day. Cyprus and the former Yugoslavia all split up without a CTA, resulting in wars, conflict, and I think a lot of problems that are not yet resolved. Interestingly, when Israel became independent, movement of Palestinians into Israel for work was a lot easier for the first 40 years. And it's only with the first Intifada and then subsequent Intifadas and terrorism that a hard border has come up between Palestine and Israel, and the construction of a wall, all of which does not seem to be contributing greatly to security, but does portend to a very unstable future. The US has, of course, got no CTA on its southern border, and I think it's fair to say that we can't see how it could be applied there, given the pressures on Mexico from South America, South and Central America. Interestingly, for Britain in Brexit, there's been relatively free movement of people up to now, but in 2023, visas will be required for British coming to Europe, even for short stays. And likewise for Europeans going to Britain. And I expect that to be a source of trouble next year. So do good fences make good neighbors? Or is it a hide that you can stand behind and fire at your neighbor? I think it might be the latter. And I really think that countries with hard borders are inherently unstable. This is Margaret Thatcher signing or agreeing to the Anglo-Irish Agreement in 1985. This, she had a hard-line approach to Ireland when she first took government in the late 1970s. It was a very difficult time. There was a lot of terrorism. The government of England was itself targeted, and Éirí Niamh, a member of cabinet, was assassinated. Margaret Thatcher used to say during elections and at several arguments that she was 100% English. And many of her members of cabinet said, we must negotiate. I have Irish relatives or Irish antecedents. Of course, somebody would do it. They found Margaret Thatcher's great-grandmother's cottage in County Kerry. Catherine O'Sullivan emigrated to Britain in the 19th century. And this is the state of the cottage, at least back in the 1990s when it was found. And they threatened to put a plaque up on it as the homestead of Margaret Thatcher. But she did at a dinner meeting, acknowledge that she had an Irish ancestor. And she said, we must do something about Ireland. And I think that it did change her attitude, leading to that agreement in 1985, which was the basis for the Good Friday Agreement 10 years later. The Good Friday Agreement has allowed a lot more interaction. The royal family have been able to visit the Republic of Ireland. On one occasion, Prince Charles was coming, and the genealogists got out their assessments and decided that he had 2 lines of descent from Brian Boru, who was the first High King of Ireland, and from whom all talks of independence start. Another genealogist pointed out, well, Brian Boru actually has hundreds of thousands of descendants, and most of them live in Britain. So this brings us to the notion of, in science, of the most recent common ancestor. So using DNA and modeling, they're now trying to figure out how far back do you have to go to find our common ancestors in various regions. And they've divided the world up in this paper in Nature in 2004 into 10 nodes. And within those nodes, you don't have to go back very far, actually, to find common ancestors for all the DNA that's now out there. A lot of those ancestors are known, like Brian Boru, as kings. And while kings had many, many children, they are people that we remember in history too. So that might be the factor. The other thing that these people were able to figure out is that it doesn't take very much for transfer of DNA from one node to another, so that as little as 100 people moving in each generation will result in complete mingling of DNA in 1,000 years. So that really undermines the whole sense of nationalism. But nationalism is a very strong urge around the world. I believe it's based on people thinking they have a natural entitlement, either to the land or to govern people. And this natural entitlement is, they say, either bestowed by God or by the fact that they were there first, but it's some sort of entitlement like that. And while it's not really based in DNA, it's a very, very strong urge. At the same time, even those people will have to admit that borders are artificial. They are the result of various events that have occurred at various times and treaties and whatever, compromises, and that people can end up on the wrong side of the border. A common travel area type agreement, as I have described to you, is really based on the principle that citizens have legitimate needs and duties on the other side of the border. I think a common travel area agreement is even more powerful than that. It actually moves belligerent nationalism from the battlefield to the sports field where it belongs. There's nothing wrong with supporting your country, with honoring your ancestors, but it's really, it's very difficult to find a reason to fight for it, except on the rugby pitch. This is the picture that you'll recognize from the newspaper a few months ago. And at the beginning, shortly after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, there was a gymnastic competition, and the man on the right there, Ivan Kuliak, wore the letter Z or Z on his singlet to support the invasion. He was a Russian, and the irony of it was that the competition was actually won by a Ukrainian. Now, what the newspapers didn't say at the time was that Kuliak comes from a Ukrainian family in Russia, and that the winner of the competition, whose name is Kovtun, actually comes from a Russian family who lives in the Ukraine. Now, you might say, what's in a name? I mean, these two athletes had declared for their countries, just as I have declared for Canada. And in truth, you're right. This is what they have declared for. But the names are important to some people, and maybe too important. The picture on the upper right that I'm showing you is the last meeting of the president of Russia with the president of the Ukraine. And you know, of course, that they are both named Vladimir. Volodymyr is the Ukrainian version of the same name. The president of Russia is quite enthralled with his name, and this enormous statue was erected by him about 10 years ago outside the Kremlin. And the picture on the lower left is Mr. Putin with Kirill, the patriarch of the Orthodox Church, dedicating the statue to Saint Vladimir. Of course, Saint Vladimir is also known as Prince Vladimir of Kiev, and he is considered both the founder of the Ukraine and the founder of Russia. And I think some of this mythology plays a very important part in the background for the president of Russia. Of course, he has his own issues in his family, in that his daughter, pictured on the lower right, is actually married to an ex-ballet dancer whose name is Igor Zelensky. He spells his name a little different to the president of the Ukraine with one Y, and the president of the Ukraine uses two Ys. Again, part of the language war that I was talking about. Well, in the end, the mission in war is to win the peace. And this is, I think, what I tried to say to Heather Hiscox in her question. And to some extent, I'm mindful of what the King said when Ireland became independent, in that he expected the British administration to support the Irish government in their effort to win the peace. And we might actually have a debt to the Afghan people to try and support them as a people to win their peace and gain the happiness that I think the Irish have managed in the 100 years since their independence. On the opposite side, though, to conduct a war, knowing that you're going to lose the peace, is probably a crime. I think this is a crime that Hitler undertook, certainly towards the latter half, the end of the Second World War, where he could not win, but he then set up so Germany could not win the peace. Fortunately, he did not succeed in that, but that was his goal. We have to question what the Russians are trying to do in the eastern Ukraine, because they are certainly not trying to win what's going to be left afterwards. Having lost the conventional war, they have now resorted to bombardment and destruction. And this is of the land that they hope to take for themselves, and they will be responsible for rebuilding it. But it will take a change of strategy for them to understand that the mission in war is to win the peace. Now, how do the Irish do it? These are last two slides on this, and I've been less successful in figuring it out because it really wasn't that well known, and I think some of this happened by accident. In 1922, after the treaty, the Irish set up a constitution committee made of civil servants who were to try and figure out the best constitution for Ireland. And they met frequently. And now, while they were dealing with very heady topics like the construction of the parliament and if there should be two houses and what representation there should be in the upper house, I think some of the nitty-gritty had to be dealt with and was passed down to lower civil servants who dealt with their counterparts on the British side. And this is the result. This is how the Common Travel Area agreement came about. And I'll just mention two British civil servants in closing, because I think they played very important roles. Sir Alfred Cope, as he became after this, and known to my grandfather as Andy Cope, was a detective in the excise department in England from the beginning of the century and through the First World War. He was he liked being outside and dealing with matters himself, even though he'd reached a fairly high office job at that time. Interestingly, in 1919, the government of Lloyd George sent a committee made up not of the usual civil servants, not of military people, not of politicians, but mainly of people from the excise department over to Ireland to investigate what was going on with the British administration in Ireland. That committee was formed by Norman Warren Fisher and led by Anderson, and Andy Cope was one of the juniors on the committee. And that committee reported back in 1919 to Lloyd George that Ireland was lost. And Andy Cope said it later in a speech that he gave in Wales, one of the very few speeches that he gave about this, in which he said that it is impossible to govern people who do not consent to be governed. And regardless of the military outcome in Ireland, it would be impossible for the British to govern Ireland after what had happened up to 1919. The war continued for several years after that, but that was the assessment then. Interestingly, Cope and Anderson were seconded to Dublin Castle and worked for the British administration. And they spent a long time forcing the administration and the military and the Irish into the situation where a truce was declared and a treaty was undertaken. Norman Warren Fisher was back in London, and he's a fascinating man. In 1919, he became head of the British Civil Service, and he remained there until 1939. And throughout the period after the negotiations that I've outlined here and until 1939, I think he constantly put out fires where there was great frustration with what was going on in Ireland. He was not only the head of the civil service for such a long time and really shaped and formed it himself, he also was the head civil servant in the Treasury. And I think he's the model for Sir Humphrey in Yes Minister, the man who was able to, as the politicians changed, keep things on an even keel. So what I hope to say is, and I convince you that the Common Travel Area Agreement is a very important milestone in the development of relations between Ireland and Britain, that it was really made by civil servants. It's a centenary that's well worth celebrating, and I think it has lessons that can be applied elsewhere in the world. Dan, thank you very much for listening to me, and thank you to all of the group.
Well, Vivian, you get an A for that paper. Well done. It doesn't mean you're going to get paid by the university, but you know, you can take it away from that for what that might be worth. No, excellent presentation. Much food for thought there. So one of the things that we teach at the college in Toronto, Canadian Forces College, we talk about conflict termination. And in that discussion, there's a concept where we talk about positive and negative peace. So negative peace is sort of referred to as conditions whereby the fighting has stopped. The fighting is over. There's no more kinetic action going on. But positive peace is where the conditions are now set such that the kinetic fight will not erupt again. In other words, the political, economic, social conditions have changed such that the peace will be long lasting. You know, we've seen, and you mentioned this a couple of times, of course, your experience in Afghanistan, and I was in Afghanistan as well, that clearly there was no positive peace achieved. There was a negative peace achieved for a period of time because it was sort of imposed upon the government, the region, et cetera. There was sufficient military power from an external source to keep the kinetic action from emerging. But once those forces left, you know, the other conditions immediately came back to erupt. So I guess I'm wondering, because you've stressed this through your presentation, what is it that you think are some of the key things that have to happen to shift from that concept of negative peace to positive peace? And who gets to play the role in all of that stuff? What do you think about that?
Well, Dan, it's a huge question, and you know, I can only answer some elements of it. I don't think there are discrete phases like some negotiators want to happen, and they say we will not negotiate until you put your arms down. We will not negotiate until there's peace. We cannot undertake development until there's security. I'm not 100% sure that those things are not just bargaining points. I think it is important for me in my analysis of the CTA to ask, is it a consequence of peace, or did it create conditions to prevent the breakdown of peace? And the answer is probably a combination, that there are obviously situations where you just can't have as free movement as there is between Britain and Ireland. But I tried to show that despite bombing campaigns, despite great world wars, that this movement continued, and the movement itself was not a threat to the security of either side. So you have to look at security separately. And I think you have to realize that if you cannot achieve a free movement situation with your neighbors, you are in a situation of war. Really, it's low level, and you're really in a very unstable situation. So you're going to have to do everything you can to change that if you're going to give a safe, happy country to those who come after you. It has to be your goal. The thing that fascinates me is now in looking at this again is is it possible to conduct a war knowing that the winning of battles is not as important, and winning, so-called winning of the war is not even important if I can actually win the peace. There was a movie, I don't know if you remember it, with Peter Ustinov. It was a comedy, and it was regarding a country, a fictional country, principality in Europe that had no money. And he inherited this country, and he decided that the only way for them to survive economically was to declare war on the United States and then lose it. So to lose the war, and now it's a facetious example, but it is the reverse example where you actually attempt to lose a war knowing that you've come out better in the end. And is that possible for people who are conducting these dreadful things, dreadful applications of force? And I think in Russia, they're going to have to ask themselves that question. I didn't say it, but I really do wish there was a Warren Fisher in Russia that could advise the president there, because I think he really needs to reassess what he's doing. The destruction that he's bringing about will not achieve the goals that he thinks. In fact, the Blitzkrieg in London actually hardened the attitude of the British to fight and conduct the Second World War. So I think the Ukrainian people will respond in exactly the same way.
Right. I was really taken by your analysis in terms of the comparison between the Irish scenario and the Ukraine scenario and all the various factors that you laid out in terms of the similarities. One of the characteristics of those conflicts that I didn't see on the list, and I'm wondering whether you think this is significant or not, is the sort of role of external influences. In the case of Ukraine, clearly this is being taken up as a kind of global cause because of the ramifications to financial markets, to food security in different parts of the world, et cetera, et cetera. There is a great deal of interest and involvement with many other countries. And I'm not sure that's true of the Irish experience. Obviously, England being the predominant player, the Irish Free State as an independent body, and Northern Ireland, clearly, but I'm not sure that there was a sense that this really mattered to anybody else. And I'm wondering whether you think that that's a valid, argument.
Yeah, I think that the times are certainly different, and some of these supports are expressed in different ways now 100 years later. The reason I think for the success of the War of Independence in Ireland 100 years ago, as opposed to other attempts that they made 100 years before that again, and in several other attempts throughout history, was actually that they did muster world opinion on their side. If you think about the support for Ukraine, it is predominantly emotional, although the reason for it is emotional. If we were very hard-nosed about our own personal situation, we could say to Russia, take the Ukraine, just leave it, forget about it, take Eastern Ukraine, whatever. But come out maybe with less of the disturbance that we are all experiencing now. But I think in the world there is a general belief that we must undertake some hardship to support the Ukraine because we're standing for principle, and that we don't want this to get worse and go elsewhere. The Irish actually undertook a very similar campaign to the campaign that the president of Ukraine has waged very successfully throughout this period to muster world support on his side. And they won the propaganda war 100 years ago very easily. Not only had they got the United States firmly behind them, and this was a major problem for Britain. that they also had their diaspora in Canada and in Australia and around the world, and even what became the Commonwealth. In South Africa, for instance, there was support for the Irish in their efforts.
Right.
So I think the similarities are greater than actually the differences in that particular one. Dan.
Okay.
I did miss a slide, and in the changeover there, and I did look at one thing which we haven't talked about, and that is that within the Russian army, there are a large number of Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians trained in the Soviet army. And the Irish were in the exact same situation in Britain, in that they formed a large minority within the British army. And for those reasons, they both then knew the conventional tactics that would be undertaken by the British army and the Russian army. They understood those straight away. And then they responded with irregular activities. In the Irish case, it was using mobile units attacking convoys, and in the Ukrainian thing, it was using drones. But it can neutralize a conventional army to have that degree of understanding. It's another parallel between Ireland and Ukraine.
Right. You mentioned in passing, as you were going through your historical overview, the Good Friday Agreement, and I guess at least one of our viewers, wants to give a shout out to General John de Chastelain as a player in helping to resolve that in terms of the arms agreements and so on and so forth. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that in terms of perhaps from the perspective of the effectiveness of, again, an external player coming along and playing a role in terms of how something like that might be resolved. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
I agree with the comment completely. I see parallels for de Chastelain and some of the British civil servants who facilitated the development within Ireland and the cessation of hostilities.
Right.
What de Chastelain really did for the group was provide the space that allowed the working civil servants of Ireland and Britain and Northern Ireland to get down and deal with the nitty-gritty. Prior to that, there had been hard lines drawn that unless arms were dumped, there would be no negotiations. And with the help of and expertise of de Chastelain, they were able to run these two things simultaneously. So they came up with an agreement and then immediately disbanded and destroyed the arms. So I think his role was critical in it and runs very much parallel to what some of the senior civil servants in Britain did for Ireland.
Right. I noted, I think just a couple of days ago, that General Rick Hillier has a role now in terms of advising the Ukrainian government on how to stand up and equip its militia forces. So I don't think that's exactly the equivalent, because he's obviously working for one side and not both sides in terms of trying to come up with an agreement. But it is interesting where you have these figures who sort of emerge and then try to take a place there. Do you? Again, this is a very sensitive topic. I mean, do you see, with everything going on with Brexit and so on, I mean, do you think that there ultimately will be an entirely unified Ireland? I mean, are things moving in that general direction?
Yeah, I know. And living in Canada, I have a different view now, maybe, than I would if I was still in Ireland. My family actually come from Northern Ireland, but my grandfather, whom I mentioned there, he moved south, and we've all been down from the Republic of Ireland since. But Dan, the principles are still the same. Nobody can be governed unless they consent to be governed. So they're going, and people want to govern themselves. The Common Travel Area Agreement is a fascinating thing in that if we really believed what we were talking about, we could have moved en masse to Northern Ireland and overwhelmed the Loyalists, or the Loyalists could have come down south and tried to dominate in the south, or they could have moved to Britain. all of these movements are totally possible, but it made a nonsense of actually fighting for it, because you can actually do anything that you want. You could always do it for the 100 years. So fighting for it actually negates, as far as I'm concerned, any aspiration to a political end. If you introduce violence, you will negate the result that you might achieve politically. In the end, yes, Ireland has a great opportunity to be both in Europe and part of the British enterprise. And if they can only keep their heads down and behave, they will end up in an extraordinarily rich situation. And I think that this is going to happen. There are changes in demographics, and there are changes in attitude down south as well as in Northern Ireland. And what we'll see in the island of Ireland in 100 years will be entirely different. It will certainly not be the nationalistic Ireland, united Ireland that we were taught about, and that they maybe talked about in the 19th century. It's definitely going to be an Ireland in cooperation with its neighbors and with Europe.
Right. So your your commentary and your analysis, would suggest that there's an opportunity being lost here in terms of Russia and Ukraine, where you have these, you have families on both sides of the border and intermixing and so on. So there's a huge opportunity for the sort of arrangements that you referred to in the Irish experience, but with the violence being imposed, it just lessens the opportunities for any kind of agreement that could see the free flow of people and the free flow of ideas and so on back and forth. So this is an unfortunate thing. One question that was asked, and it's an interesting one, is whether the sort of CTA agreement that you've been talking about is or potentially could be used as a model between the Canadian federal government and our First Nations. Is that something that would be, is that a viable way of, shall we say, analyzing the relationship between Canada and our First Nations? I'm not sure.
Well, some of the principles that are involved in it can definitely be applied, and to allow First Nations develop a sense of self-governance and recognition of activities that the First Nations government undertake elsewhere in Canada may well be a very important part of a rapprochement. I think there already is free movement, and we got rid of restrictions that were present up in the first half of the 20th century, which were, outlandish. We did not know that First Nations could not take up full citizenship of Canada. And all of those restrictions are gone. The bilateral approach where, say, non-First Nation Canadians could move on reserve, I can't see that at the moment being a useful thing for negotiation. But I think the respect that came out of the negotiations is something that does allow for positive relations to develop. And then that creates the situation where both sides of the border flourish. And that's exactly what we want, I believe, with the First Nations. So there certainly are elements to it. You can't take it lock, stock, and barrel, for sure.
Right. Yeah, no, good observation. Vivian, last question for you. Before we start to wrap this up, we're doing very well. We normally wrap up about 8 o'clock, but I can see that virtually all the people that were signed on are still here. I kind of take that as my indication as to how things are going. So it's a great thing. The question sort of revolves around, the fundamental intentions of the various parties where you have in Ireland and in the UK, for example, in England, a fundamental, commitment to democratic rule. And so therefore you have a kind of basis on which to form the discussions and form the negotiations and so on. Again, is this something that's quite different in the Ukraine-Russian experience where, perhaps Russia is using Ukraine as I mean, clearly on the one hand, it seems to be pretty obvious that, Putin wants to, in effect, control Ukraine. But is this also a test, in your view, of NATO as a whole, Western values as a whole? Is that the right level of analysis here, or should we be focused more on the more specifics of what's going on between these two states? Or is this something that we should be looking at as a broader, contentious sort of example?
Well,
sorry about that last question.
Okay. You are right that the democracy is the basis for all of this. As Andy Cope said, you cannot govern people who do not consent to be governed. And that's the end of it. You can create situations where you dominate them and think, but it's unstable. So democracy remains the basis of all of this. And 100 years ago, it was a democratic movement where they won all of the, majority of the seats in the House of Parliament in London, and then moved to Dublin, and they won the general election after that, and then they won within the Parliament. So it was purely democratic in its background. And when you think in the situation with Russia and Ukraine, I think an opportunity was lost between 2014 and up to the invasion, that it was essential that situation be resolved before outright war occurred. I think that there are elements within Russia who did not want that to happen because they knew, and there are always elements in government who benefit by war. And we have to be careful of that. They're not necessarily democratic. I think if you ask the people on both sides, would you vote for a war to invade Ukraine and ask the people of Russia? I doubt you'd have got the majority to sign on and say, let's go do it. And likewise, in the Ukraine, if you had a question, say, will we resist to the point that we will drive them to war? I doubt you would ask, the majority will be asking for some sort of an arrangement. The thing that concerned me most prior to the invasion was the fact that Ukraine blocked the water on the canal to the Crimea. And that's a well-known casus belli. And you should have, I wish they had got rid of all of those overt causes of war and tried to get something going like the CTA, which really reduces the need for war to a point of being ridiculous. If the people are moving back and forth and carrying on normal lives. And I have friends who live in the Ukraine and who had cottages or summer homes on the far side of the line in eastern Ukraine prior to the invasion. And they used to go across as much as possible, and then they'd be struggling because they couldn't do it. But if all of those barriers were broken down, it would be very difficult for unrepresentative governments to take you into war. But the situation does apply now that they're in war, and how we get to the situation where there'll be peace and when they will inevitably have a CTA, because people will do it. They just insist. They will cross the border, and the governments can try all they like to block it, but they will eventually win. So that will happen. And I just wish it could happen with less bloodshed.
So Vivian, thank you so much for your presentation tonight. It was incredible. I learned a lot, and I very much enjoyed having you back. I'm sure we're going to have you back again in the near future, whether it's online or in person, hopefully in person, and we can hoist one together with an Irish whiskey at the Long Bar.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much.
Take care. Stay safe. See you soon. Thanuja, thanks again, and we'll sign off now. Take care.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.